11. It looks like it's exactly 11 o'clock, right?
Great.
Okay, very good. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today's presentation called ARPA Fiscal Recovery Funds, Compliance and Monitoring. I'm Vicki Urbanek, Porter County Auditor, and I want to thank everyone for attending today's session, taking time out of your busy day. This is an exciting time for us in Porter County. It's an exciting project, and there's lots to learn about, lots to discuss. And so we are having these presentations to help share information about what the Fiscal Recovery Fund program is all about, and to help spread the information, foster better understanding, and hopefully get us to an end result here in Porter County where we can come up with a spending plan that we're all very proud of. Okay, so before we really begin, I just want to make a few introductory comments about today's presentation. I'm here speaking to you as County Auditor. I'm not speaking from the perspective of the County Commissioners or the County Council members. I'm strictly here as the County Auditor, and in my role as County Auditor, one of my main objectives with overseeing this program is in the area of compliance. Basically, I want to make sure, my office wants to make sure that whatever final decisions are made here in Porter County government, that we are in compliance with the U.S. Treasury's final rule and with all other regulations that we must abide by. Secondly, I'm here speaking to you from the standpoint of the perspective of the county government. We know that cities and towns and even state governments have received part of these federal funds, but I'm talking strictly from the standpoint of the county government. And then lastly, this is sort of a disclaimer here. In the accounting and auditing universe, it's not uncommon for us to hear new interpretations, new directives, new guidance. And that could happen with this program as well. So there may be something that we talk about today, and it's based on our understanding as it is today, and then weeks or months down the road, we might hear a different interpretation or a different authoritative guidance. So I just put that out there. Okay, so why don't we begin with this first slide that we have. This is a very brief summary of what has happened in the past year regarding this particular program as it relates to Porter County. Of course, it more or less all began almost exactly a year ago today on March 11th, 2021, when President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act into law. Now, the American Rescue Plan Act is a very extensive piece of federal legislation. There are many, many components of it. The program that we're talking about here today deals with a part of ARPA that can be found in a section 602 and 603 called the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. So I just want everyone to know that even though we tend to talk about this as Porter County's ARPA project or the City of Valparaiso's ARPA plan, we're really talking about the Fiscal Recovery Fund section of ARPA, also known as SLFRF. So if you hear me call it Fiscal Recovery Fund or SLFRF, we just know that we're all talking about the same part of ARPA, which designated about $350 billion of federal aid to government units throughout our country, and that included states and counties. Counties received, or were allocated, I should say, $65 billion. Of course, Porter County is one of slightly more than 3,000 county governments in our country, and our allocation is going to total $33 million of that. Now, the other pictures here, if we kind of go around clockwise in May, we received what's called our first tranche of the SLFRF allocation, and we put it into its own fund here in our ledger, and that's a screenshot of our ledger. And then the other pictures just show that over the last, how many months has it been? Almost 12 months. There have been numerous webinars and seminars and presentations that we at the County Auditor's Office have participated in. And in one case, we had the opportunity to help organize the presentations. So there's been a lot of training sessions geared towards county auditors and commissioners and other fiscal officers of local government to help us understand this new federal grant program. And then on January 6th of this year, the U.S. Treasury released what's called the final rule. And this is going to be our guidebook as we go forward implementing this program. Now, there are other rules that we have to follow. We can't ignore existing local, state, or federal rules. We can't ignore some audit requirements that are under what's called the uniform guidance. But basically, the final rule is what we're going to use as our guidebook to help make sure that we are in compliance. And this is my binder of the final rule. And last night, I just decided I'm going to have to get a bigger binder because this is getting bigger and bigger for me to carry all of this information together. And then the very last picture is a screenshot of what happened in our county on February 22nd, which was a week ago today in this very room. On that day, the county commissioners approved an updated spending plan, and it set in motion the beginnings of 4 projects in Porter County. So, before we talk about that spending plan, let's talk about the expenditure categories that are allowed in the final rule. These are the 4 main expenditure categories. They are shown here in order from the most flexible to the most restrictive. Now we're going to take a pretty brief overview of these expenditure categories. Some of you were at some previous presentations that I gave earlier, actually not this month, but in February, on February 8th. Some of this information will be repeated. There'll be some additional slightly adjusted or new information. But for the most part, we're going to just talk a little bit about some of these categories. We're going to spend a little bit more time on a couple others. So the first expenditure category is revenue loss. And basically, under this expenditure category, government recipients, such as Porter County, can allocate certain expenditures under this category for whatever general government service that's desired. Now, there are some restrictions, there's some prohibitions where we cannot use our SLFRF funds on certain initiatives, but if it doesn't fall into one of those prohibited categories, we can allocate our expenditures to this category, and it does not come under the same type of restrictions that the rest of the categories require. Now, under revenue loss, we can calculate our actual revenue loss that was incurred as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, or we can opt for a standard allowance of up to $10 million of our SLFRF allocation. Now, the next expenditure category is a very extensive one in the final rule. This is titled Public Health and Negative Economic Impacts. Now, in order for us to have a project under this category, we need to do an analysis, if you will. We need to identify that there was a harm or an impact caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And in some cases, we need to identify the individuals or the groups of people, classes of people, if you will, that were impacted. And then we need to devise a project, whether it's a program, a service, or a capital expenditure that responds to that impact. Our responses must be reasonably proportional to the impact. Now, what I just said may sound like a lot of words, but it really is a good analysis that's laid out in the final rule that's going to help us determine if we are in compliance. So I'm going to break this category apart into two different sections, and the first is going to be focused on public health. So on our next slide, the public health category is further broken down into 4 subcategories, if you will. Now, in the boxes, I pulled out just some of the enumerated uses in the final rule. When I say enumerated use, that means that it is an actual eligible use that's specifically listed in the final rule. Now, not all of these, the items that I have listed in those boxes, not all of those are the only expenditures that are allowed. There are many, many other enumerated uses. Yes? No, that's fine.
Thinking about it. So where would you find that language that you're showing to the right there in the final rule? Would we Google a certain topic once we brought up, and search once we're brought up that final rule document? How do we get to that point right there? Because I think that's very important.
Okay, very good. So the question was, how do we find this in the final rule? Well, if you were to call up the final rule, you could do a search, Control F, and you can type in a topic, a number if you want. Correct. And then you might come across dozens of entries. Prior to the presentation, I was speaking with another audience member who Googled, or who had a search for the word tourism and found, I think, 40 references to that. If you could hold your thought, I'm going to address something that you just brought up a little bit later about how to find topics in the final rule efficiently. Or another option is that you can read the whole final rule and take notes and mark it all up. There you go, exactly. Yes, we have a few of those here. Yes, but if I will come back to that, but remind me to bring that up.
I want to make a note.
Yeah. So basically, under these different categories, we can devise projects that fit any of these eligible uses. So under COVID-19 mitigation and prevention, that is the one that addresses a variety of public health programs, anything from new vaccination sites to PPE to actual building enhancements to allow for greater social distancing or mitigation of the spread of diseases. The behavioral health category addresses the impacts that the pandemic caused on mental health. And so basically the final rule is saying that we can use our SLFRF allocations for programs that serve mental health needs or behavioral health. Medical expenses is another category. One example is that recipient governments can use our SLFRF allocations for some of our medical expenditures, like our county employee health insurance program. And the last subcategory deals with responding to violence. The final rule goes into a discussion about how COVID-19 exacerbated violence in some communities, specifically domestic violence, and in some communities, gun violence. So we can use our SLFRF allocations on programs that deal with violence. Anything from hiring new prosecutors to street gang intervention programs to assistance for victims of domestic violence in terms of programs or relocation. So there's a lot of flexibility within these categories. In this section of the final rule, if you come up with a program that deals with public health or public safety, you'll probably find it allowed in one of these subcategories. Now, the next part of this category is called negative economic impacts. This part of the final rule recognizes that there were groups of people, whether households or businesses or nonprofits, that were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, maybe not from a public health standpoint, but they were impacted financially, and they were impacted in a negative financial area. Now, under the very first subcategory is assistance to households, and this is a very extensive part of the final rule. In order to provide programs or services in this subcategory, the eligible beneficiaries, the recipients, if you will, need to fall under one of these categories. Households that experienced unemployment, food or housing insecurity, or low or moderate income households. And the final rule gives a pretty good description of how we can ascertain that we have households that meet those different categories. Now, under assistance to households, there are many, many enumerated uses that are spelled out in the final rule. And again, I highlighted the word include because there are even more enumerated uses than what I'm able to put on this screen. So let's look at some of these programs. We could use our SLFRF funding to provide legal aid to help households in eviction notices. We can come up with programs to help households pay their delinquent property taxes or their mortgages. Yes, we can come up with programs to help provide counseling services for people to be able to access public benefits and other public services. We can use the program for after-school tutoring programs or child care services. The list really does go, it's very long, it's very extensive. It is, at least in my version of the final rule, I think this particular topic spans 70 pages. Now, the version of the final rule that I just mentioned is not the version that's published in the Federal Register, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, also under the category of negative economic impacts are two other categories called assistance to nonprofits and assistance to small businesses. Now, while the definition of nonprofits and small businesses are different, obviously, the requirements in these two subcategories are very similar. Basically, in order for us to give direct aid to small businesses or nonprofits, we have to show proof that the business or small profit suffered from the pandemic in a negative sense financially. And there's a variety of ways that we can ascertain that. The final rule discusses how we can look at their financial statements. We can look to see if they had increased costs. We can look to see if they laid off their employees. But basically, if you're a small business or a nonprofit and you did not suffer financially, you're not eligible for the aid under these categories. Now, before I go on, I do want to make a very important distinction. There is a difference between what we call a beneficiary and a subrecipient. A beneficiary means that we're using our SLFRF monies in direct assistance. So in the case of, let's say, a nonprofit or a small business, we can use our SLFRF monies for direct aid in the form of a grant or a loan to help a struggling small business get back on its feet, to help a nonprofit stabilize. They are considered the beneficiary because they're the end user of this money. Now, what if we have a nonprofit that wants to propose carrying out a project? Let's say we have a nonprofit that wants to provide, and I'm completely making this up, I have no preconceived notions of that there's going to be a project like this. But let's say that we have a nonprofit that wants to provide an after-school tutoring program. Well, in that case, that nonprofit does not need to show proof of a financial impact. In that case, they would be treated as a subrecipient, and the county government would essentially be giving them what's called a sub-award. We would be passing on our federal award to them. They would be considered a sub-recipient, and they would be carrying out one of these projects, in a sense, on our behalf. So another way that you might want to think of it is that the county commissioners, in conjunction with the county council, might think that this particular project is a good project, but we're not going to do it ourselves. We're going to have this nonprofit do it for us. The reason why I want to bring up the distinction between the beneficiary and the subrecipients is because when it gets to compliance and reporting, we will need to treat subrecipients a little bit differently than beneficiaries. For example, we will be required to have a written agreement between us and the subrecipients. And I can go into that a little bit in more detail. You'll probably hear more about it as the weeks go on and as we get more of our projects firmed up. Then the last subcategory under negative economic impacts, it addresses assistance to impacted industries. We can, as a recipient government, identify certain industries that were also impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The final rule presumes, however, that if you are in the tourism or the hospitality industry, you were already financially impacted. You were already negatively impacted. And so we can use our SLFRF funds to provide assistance to these negatively impacted industries, including tourism.
So your office then will monitor those contracts and projects?
Yes, our office will be monitoring all of our expenditures.
So anybody that is receiving ARPA funds should have someone in place to monitor those subrecipient contracts?
Absolutely,
Yeah, I
absolutely.
see that as critical.
Well, it's not just critical, it's required. And I'll talk a little bit about that under compliance, where we are required to have a written agreement with our subrecipients, because as a recipient government, we are still responsible for the proper use of those monies.
The folks stop should
Yes, exactly. Now, before I go on, I do just want to make a comment about all of the enumerated uses that we talked about. What if we come up with a project that we think is a very good project, but it's not exactly listed in the final rule? Or we think we have a great beneficiary, but they're not really identified as a beneficiary in the final rule. Does that mean we are barred from pursuing that project? Well, the best answer is maybe we are, but not necessarily. And the reason why is the final rule gives us some flexibility to devise projects that go beyond what's listed as an enumerated use. We also have some flexibility to devise or to identify beneficiaries that are not necessarily listed as an eligible beneficiary. The final rule gives us standards to follow, gives us a framework to follow. If we come to that point in county government, my advice will be that we have to be very cautious. We have to come up with a very well thought and reasoned explanation, a very well thought and reasoned justification, if you will, in terms of why we think this project is in compliance, even though it goes beyond what is enumerated in the final rule. Okay, so that's that iffy part of the final rule. Now, let's go on to the other expenditure categories, and then we'll be coming back to some of the compliance issues that we just talked about. Yes. Next category is premium pay. I'm just going to whiz over this very quickly. Premium pay is defined as additional payments to eligible employees for essential services that respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. There are some additional prohibitions in premium pay, but basically this part of the final rule allows recipient governments to use part of their allocation, or all of their allocation if they so choose, for premium pay, which is additional payments to their employees. Or we could also enter into contracts with third parties to award premium pay to their employees as well. And now we come to the very last category, the very last expenditure category, called investments in water, sewer, and broadband. Now, this category is often called the infrastructure category. But when most people think of infrastructure, we think of roads and bridges. This expenditure category, as you may recall from one of the very first slides, is the most restrictive category. It is really limited to water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure, not roads, not bridges. In fact, generally speaking, roads are not allowed under the SLFRF program. Of course, there are some exceptions that we can talk about. Now, within the categories of water and sewer especially, there is some flexibility with respect to what water and sewer projects we can embark upon. Generally speaking, projects that are allowed under the EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Fund program and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund program, generally speaking, are eligible. There are also eligible or enumerated uses in this category that discusses MS4 projects and stormwater projects, shoreline remediation, and wetland enhancements. There's consumer programs to encourage water conservation efforts, including a rebate program for the use of rain barrels. So there are a variety of different ways that we can use our money under this infrastructure category, but again, I need to emphasize it really is limited to these categories called water, sewer, and broadband. Now, at one of the prior sessions we had, someone pointed out that I have in the slide, I think I have in the slide, green infrastructure. What does green infrastructure mean? Well, I looked up green infrastructure. EPA actually has a good definition of green infrastructure, and from my interpretation, it really is focused still in the water area. Not so much, solar panels or, I don't know, electric vehicles, let's say. It's really under the category of water and water conservation and water preservation programs. So again, if we are pursuing a project in this category, the final rule goes into quite a bit of detail in terms of what we are limited in using our money on. Now, before I go to the next part of our presentation, I did just want to make a few additional comments. One deals with capital expenditures. Capital expenditures are allowed under the SLFRF program, but they may be subject to additional reporting requirements. Generally speaking, if we come up with a capital expenditure, let's say a building improvement, a building enhancement. If it's more than $1 million, we have to prepare a written justification, and we have to follow some very specific steps that are laid out in the final rule as to what is in that written justification. And I also wanted to mention again that if you are interested in pursuing a project that doesn't seem to fit precisely in these expenditure categories, you'll need to look at the section of the final rule that addresses the framework that you need to follow, because we need to make sure that all of our expenditures are fully in compliance with the final rule and with all other regulations. But again, the U.S. Treasury's final rule does give us some flexibility to develop these programs that go beyond what's specifically listed. Okay. Now, with that, I'd like to go on to the next part of the presentation, where we're going to talk a little bit more about our county's projects and some compliance issues. With the next slide, yes, this next slide gives you a listing of where we are right now in Porter County. As I mentioned, on February 22nd, the county commissioners adopted a revised expenditure plan, and then later that night, the county council approved the required appropriations. As I mentioned before, we have to follow all other existing rules, and at least in Indiana, nothing with some limited exceptions, nothing can get spent out of our county funds without a council-approved appropriation. And so we have 4 active projects, if you will, that have already had funds appropriated for them. The first is premium pay, and that's why I didn't really discuss premium pay too much, because our county council back in budget hearings last fall decided that they would hold off on across-the-board raises until some other studies are done, but instead we would work towards giving premium pay to certain eligible employees. Now, the restrictions that the county council put on the premium pay payments were limited to the following groups of people, basically those who are in the public health and public safety sectors. Not all county employees are receiving premium pay. Now, the amount that you see that was appropriated was the amount that was appropriated by the Porter County Council. How much will actually be spent? Well, as of right now, we haven't spent anything, but literally by, I think, tomorrow night or Thursday morning, we will have something showing up in that expenditure column. And that is because this week is payroll week in county government, and we are paying out the premium pay with this week's payroll. And so we'll find out exactly how much we are spending. The reason why there's some fluctuations is because of some additional restrictions that the county council put on the premium pay. Basically, you have to still be a county employee in order to receive this payment. It makes sense, but we needed that in that restriction so that people didn't think that they could resign, let's say in December, and still get this payment. We do know that there were some people who left. So we do think that that appropriation is on the high side. We specifically asked to advertise a little bit higher to give us some of this flexibility. Now, the other programs, the other projects that have an appropriation approved for them, as you can see in the second column, we're showing you the expenditure category that we believe that we will be assigning these particular projects to when it comes time to report our projects. The behavioral health study is going to fall under that behavioral health component in the public health category. We have a township assistance program, and the commissioners have placed this in the responding to the negative economic impacts category. So I think there's a presumption that most of the projects that the townships might carry out would fall under the category of assistance to households. And then the last project that has been approved is the Marquette Trail, and this would potentially fall under the aid to impacted industries, including tourism, but it could also be placed into the revenue loss category. And that's because of some restrictions on what we can use our SLFRF dollars for. So this graph is going to be updated, and it's going to be expanded as we go through with our program. Now, the next, yes?
On the township dollars, is that going to be direct dollars given to the township, or is that going to be a program that is a subrecipient?
Yes. Unless there is a different interpretation forthcoming, the townships are going to be acting as our subrecipients. So we have a process that's being worked on right now. I think it's a good process. The commissioners are giving flexibility to the townships with respect to how they want to use these monies. But we know that we're going to have a written agreement with each of the townships. And that written agreement right now is under review. But the process that we believe is going to work is going to be basically the following. The townships will have to submit to our office their proposal and their budget. We need to know how they plan to spend their monies. We'll incorporate that proposal into this written agreement. The written agreement must be approved by both parties, i.e. the township and the county commissioners. And then, depending on the nature of the project, we will release the funding. And it's not clear exactly how we'll release it. It will depend on the nature of the program. For example, let's say that we have a township that wants to purchase something, purchase a good or contract out for something. Well, they could, when it's time for their vendor to submit an invoice, they could submit an invoice directly to our office and we will pay it out of their allocation. That is the approach that we prefer. We have all of our supporting documentation right there. We can track every penny of it. Now, there might be some instances where it makes more sense to advance the township's money. However, they will still have to get us all of their documentation so that we could track every penny that they are spending. The terms and conditions are going to be spelled out in that written agreement. Yes, yes.
Does that bypass the council then?
Does that bypass the council?
Talk specifically about township trustees and the commissioners.
Right, and that is the written agreement that will need to be entered into that spells out in detail how they plan to use their monies. In terms of whether the county council needs to give their approval, I'm going to have to kick that for legal counsel.
Okay. Because earlier you said that the council must approve.
Yes, the council must approve the appropriations. The issue here is, to what extent will the council be involved in overseeing the township expenditures?
Yeah, that is.
And I can't answer that right now. We can discuss that further.
Thank you.
But you did grant the appropriations, so there is that appropriation already there. Yes. Okay. Now, the next slide is a brief look at the committee structure. Also on February 22nd, the county commissioners and the county council agreed to a new committee structure to look at the uses of the remaining SLFRF allocation. So basically, how I tried to visualize this is that there's going to be a steering committee that's going to work in conjunction with 4 subcommittees. The reason why I say in conjunction is because there's going to be a lot of communication going back and forth. But really, the subcommittees are the ones who are going to be looking at various requests and various proposals. The subcommittees are going to be making their recommendations to the steering committee. And then the steering committee will be presenting those recommendations to the county commissioners for the basic plan approval and to the county council for the appropriation. So we're going to go through the process that we just went through, essentially all over again. Now, let me tell you that our county just yesterday, February 28th, opened up a new ARPA, I guess it could be called module or portal. And this replaces some of the other language that was on the county's website, and it allows people to actually submit proposals or suggestions or ideas, as well as to apply to serve as citizen representatives on these subcommittees. So if any of you are interested or know anyone who's interested, please go to our county's website, which is porterco.org. You cannot miss it. It is right there. It's right there at the very beginning. There's a button. Yes.
Excuse me. You just outlined 4 categories of whatever you want to call it, funding, and then you got four subcommittees. Are those exactly relative?
That's a very insightful question. The question is, do these subcommittees speak directly to the expenditure categories? And the answer is no. As you can see, we don't really have a premium pay subcategory. We
Right.
don't have to. We don't have to. We can design our subcommittees in any way that we feel is reasonable. I can tell you, I don't know if it's actually a subcommittee, but I have seen elsewhere an economic development subcategory or sub-program, if you will. And economic development is not listed in the final rule. But that's a good point. I think what you're getting at is the difference between the expenditure categories and the subcommittees. So let's say,
Because you have facilities up there, and it distinctly says that there is no capital expenditure allowed.
okay, no, there are capital expenditures allowed. Let's talk about facilities.
Only COVID-related capital expenditures, that's it. 'Cause I've read this.
So let's talk about facilities, for example. Let's say that there is a proposal, and in this case, there was a proposal, whether it's still going to be there or not, I don't know. But a building enhancement so that there'll be a greater spacious room for a jury room selection. That would be assigned to the infrastructure and facilities subcommittee more than likely. However, when it comes time for us to report that expenditure, we would probably put it under the public health category, COVID-19 mitigation and prevention. So a way to think about this is that the subcommittees are more of the planning process. What program, what projects are we as the county government going to come up to? And then when we get into, does this fit with the final rule? Where does it fit? Well, we'll probably say that that particular project fits under this category or under this category. Let me try to get a different county government COVID health response. There could be a project that subcommittee looks at that we might assign to a whole different category that doesn't even sound like that. I can't think of anything right off the hand. So don't get bogged down in the expenditure categories versus subcommittees. This is more of the planning process, the budgeting process, if you will.
Okay.
But they're going to have to go into those expenditure categories to make sure that the projects comply. Yeah. I also do see the potential for some crossover. Projects might fit into this subcommittee or they might fit into this subcommittee. I think we're not going to try to put down any hard and concrete restrictions on how we go forward. We need to have some flexibility so that we come up with the best result, the best outcome possible.
Okay.
Now, in response to capital expenditures that are purely COVID-related, I would tend to agree with you from the standpoint that they respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the final rule addresses what is responsive. But not all capital expenditures or building enhancements must be for social distancing or mitigation. Some are. They're in the final rule. They talk about assistance to small businesses to establish outdoor seating patios. That's a COVID-19 mitigation. But let's say a program that might assist safety. Let's think about that. There is an actual prohibition against like building new jails and new correctional facilities, but safety enhancements, yes.
Upgrade or something.
Like an electrical upgrade or video equipment so that people could attend, like I mentioned, the jury room selection virtually. I believe that would be in compliance. Again, that would probably fall under the COVID-19 mitigation and prevention category. So we could have a subcommittee, even in infrastructure, ending up with a program that we're going to assign into the public health category. So, But that's a very insightful question, actually, yes. So we have these 4 subcommittees. They are composed of a county commissioner, 2 council members, 2 citizen appointments. There are technical advisors that are non-voting for each. And like I said, they will be working, the subcommittees will be working with the steering committee. All of these meetings are going to be open to the public, and there will be provisions for accepting public input. Now, I do want to mention some of the deadlines in case anyone is interested. The deadline for applying to serve as a citizen on any of these subcommittees is March 8th. The funding proposals, actual requests from groups and organizations, is due March 31st. And then the commissioners are expected to appoint their citizen members at their meeting on March 15th. And the county council is expected to appoint their citizen committee members at their meeting on March 21st. Do keep in mind, for those of you who do really watch county government closely, the county council typically meets on the 4th Tuesday of the month, but the March meeting has been rescheduled to that Monday. So it is going to be on Monday, March 21st. And then the tentative plan is that the steering committee will attempt to meet in the month of March, at least for the very first organizational planning meeting. And I probably should say, in case you didn't know, I have been honored to be selected to be the chair of the steering committee. Again, this is a non-voting position. My role is going to sort of be, I'm going to be wearing 2 hats. One is going to be organizational, as the chair of the steering committee, and the other, obviously, is compliance related. Okay, so lots of big events happening in our county in the coming weeks and months. There is on the county's website a suggested, or I think it's called proposed or tentative timeline. And if you're interested in what that timeline is, please go look at that. It's all laid out very nicely. Okay. And I do want to say I had nothing to do with that layout. The person who was responsible is sitting right here at the back of the room. So if you have any questions, go to him on those. Okay, now let's move on. Now, what makes this federal grant program a little bit different is a number of things. We in Porter County receive a number of federal grants. We do this every year. And what's on the screen right now is kind of fresh, hot off the presses. Every year, we must report our federal grants as part of our annual financial report, and just yesterday was the deadline for most government units in Indiana to submit their annual financial reports. And so if you're interested in looking up anyone's annual financial reports, you can go on the state's portal called Gateway, and you could look it up, and ours is there. We have to report our federal awards under what's called a CFA. It's the Schedule of Expenditures of Federal Awards. And this is just a section of our CFA that we just submitted yesterday. And the one that is highlighted is, in fact, our ARPA allocation. And you could see, well, you probably can't see from where you're sitting, but it's just over $16 million, and nothing has been expended. This is as of December 31st. So you can see there's lots of other federal grants, and believe you me, the list is a lot longer than what I'm able to put on the screen. What makes the ARPA program different is partially because of how we can use the money. Most of our other federal grants, if not all, designate a very specific use for that federal award. Well, as we all know, with our SLFRF allocation, we have some flexibility. We were actually given the money in advance, and now we have to justify how we are to use it. Many of our other federal awards, when you say most, are actual reimbursement awards. Of course, what also makes the SLFRF program different is the level of reporting. We are used to reporting on our annual report our federal awards, and we are separately audited on our federal grant awards. And I am very proud of our staff because we have had some very clean audit findings with our federal awards in recent years, and we intend to continue that. But with our SLFRF program, we are going to be subject to even more reporting than what we are used to. So on the next page, this is also straight hot off the presses. Yesterday, amidst many other things that were happening in our office yesterday, U.S. Treasury issued its updated compliance manual. Now, to the general public, this may not mean much because it really speaks to those of us who have to follow the regulations for reporting and compliance. But we knew that this was coming because up until just yesterday, the compliance manual aligned itself with the interim final rule. Now we have the final rule, and so we knew that things were going to have to be updated. And this is a slightly revised reporting schedule that all of us, governments in our country, have to follow. Here in Porter County, we are a Tier 2 recipient, and that means that essentially we have to submit quarterly reports to U.S. Treasury. They're called project and expenditure reports, and we have to submit it quarterly, and our next one is due April 30th, and that is going to cover the time period from January 1st through the end of March. And we know that this next report is going to get, it's going to show some detail. Our first report really had not much detail because we had nothing obligated, we had nothing expended. But we know that we will have premium pay and maybe some other projects that we will have to be reporting. So if we were a larger entity, like let's say a very large metropolitan city, New York City or San Francisco, or a state government, we would have to comply with different reporting requirements. If we were a smaller county, we would have a different reporting schedule. As someone who is very big on transparency and accountability, I really like this added layer of reporting. It's going to help the public, and it's also going to help the recipient governments because we are going to be able to track our expenditures. We are being really held to the fire where we're going to have to monitor these expenditures as we go along because we can't miss that reporting deadline. If any of you are thinking, well, it sounds like the auditor's office has a whole new lot of work on its plate, you're right, but it's something that we're up for, we're excited for, and again, I think that this reporting requirement is something that's absolutely crucial because we are dealing with a very large federal award. And I should have mentioned it when the CFA was up. To the best of our knowledge, this is our largest federal award that we've received, at least in recent years. We've received lots of federal grants, but this is the single largest one. Okay, so now the next slide shows a reporting schedule. This is for the Tier 2 entities like Porter County. These are all of the reports that we will be required to submit through the project completion date of 2026. And now the next page is one you can't read. But this is also hot off the presses, straight from Treasury's updated compliance guideline. When I talked about the need to have a lot of details with how we spend the money, it's because of these reporting requirements. So you can't really see it, but let's just say that we have a project here in Porter County where it's going to be assistance to households. Well, we can't just report it under that category, assistance to households. We'll have to pick one of these more detailed subcategories, like it might say household assistance, health insurance, or household assistance, child care. And that is why we will have to document in great detail every expenditure because we will be audited on this and they'll be looking at these project reports. Yes?
So a city, and I know you're not here talking about cities, but the difference, say for a city like Portage, we report annually, but the same type of reporting is required, correct?
To the best of my knowledge, yes. But I don't want
I know
to
you're not
give
speaking
you,
to the city.
I don't have access to your city's portal, so I can't really see what's up there. But to the best of my knowledge, these are the same expenditure categories.
Thank you.
I will look that up for you and get back with you,
I appreciate that.
but these are, I believe so, because this isn't just devised just for Tier 2 entities.
It's,
Yeah. And, you know, you could ask, is this also applicable to state governments? Keep in mind, state governments also have SLF or F allocations as well. I believe the answer to that is yes. Okay, now, let's get to the next page. This is sort of in response to two of the audience comments earlier. We're working on something that really helped me early on when Treasury first released its final rule. I'm going to admit, I had a problem trying to find what I was looking for. And so I created a table of contents to help me. And let me tell you, it has come in it's been a handy resource. But now when you look up the final rule online, the only version that I have been able to see is the one that's published in the Federal Register. And the difference is that it's published in 3 columns, whereas the very first release was a single column page, like a normal document. And so what we're working on is, for lack of a better title, the final rule finder. And this will be a reference guide, not just for our office, but for any other member of the public who wants to use it. If you are interested in, let's say, finding out where can you find this discussion in the final rule on COVID-19 mitigation and prevention, we're going to list for you the page of the Federal Register as well as the column.
Can we get a copy of that?
Yes, but not right now. And the question is, can you get a copy of it? I hesitated to show this because it's not yet done, but it's almost done. What we're going to do is we're going to be posting it on the auditor's website. And yes, yes. So the comment was, if I give the link, we could put it on the main ARPA page. And yes, I do want to give this disclaimer. This is not an official document, but I think it's perfectly fine to do this. I don't think anyone like Treasury could be upset because, you know, you would think, I don't want to make it sound like this is someone else's document, in case I'm missing something, or these are just the topics that I think are important. But one question that came up at a prior presentation was, where can I find, I mentioned this before, where can I find the discussion on green infrastructure? And I have been asked about climate projects, climate resiliency projects. And there's actually a discussion in the final rule under the infrastructure category, under water and sewer. And so it's not on this page, but you would be able to go to that section in the final rule. I do want to mention that Treasury released what's called an overview of the final rule. It's about 44 pages, and it gives a very good overview of the final rule. But I strongly encourage reading the final rule. The final rule goes into a lot more depth and a lot more analysis and a lot more detail. And so recognizing that there may be some individuals who really don't care about maybe the public health category, their focus is just in water projects. Well, this guide might help them get right to that point. There is a danger, though, because there are some areas where you are going to be referenced to another section. For example, a capital expenditure. If you are proposing a capital expenditure in, let's say, the public health subcategory, you're going to be referenced back to a special section just on capital expenditures that gives you more detail on what you have to do to follow the rules for capital expenditures. I keep saying what you have to do. From the standpoint of the recipient government, I intend that not just the beneficiaries or the subrecipients and the county government, but we're all going to work together to make sure that we have all of the reporting requirements lined up and in compliance. Now, I just sort of outlined how we must report to U.S. Treasury. I also indicated how we report our federal awards, which is on a statewide reportal. I'd like to share with you, if we could jump to the auditor's webpage, some of the additional information that we are planning, that we've already put on our particular webpage. I do want to note that the county government has the webpage, the website, and there's lots of information about ARPA, specifically the subcommittee process and the submission of public input. On the, yes, yeah, this is the main county page, and you could see the ARPA section is right out at the top. If you go to the auditor page, we're going a little bit, we're taking a slightly different direction because we are the auditor's office. And so we're going to be focusing on more of the tracking and compliance provisions. So this is our auditor's page, and there is a link at the very beginning that talks about COVID-19 federal funding. We talked about CARES Act last year, but now we're focusing on ARPA. And if we just scroll down just a little bit, we have the summary of the 4 projects that we talked about, and that is going to be updated as we go forward. If we go to some of these, yes, if we go to some of these side pages or sub-pages, you can scroll up. The first subpage is called ARPA Resources and Updates. This is a listing of some of the resources that I have found particularly helpful. Of course, U.S. Treasury is listed first because their website has so much information about the American Rescue Plan Act and the SLFRF program. There are other references. I really want to give a shout out to NACO, the National Association of Counties. They have an enormous amount of resources about ARPA and SLFRF. You can go there and you can get ideas of what other counties are using their allocations for. And this is something that we hope to be talking about with the subcommittees as well. And then if you scroll down just a little bit, oh, okay. Yeah, we can go to the Porter County ARPA timeline. This is basically a journal, if you will, of some of the most significant events dealing with our county's participation in ARPA. I think it's important that we document this because a member of the public months from now might say, you know, when was that one county council meeting where they appropriated this? And so they might have to go back looking at the council minutes or the council agendas. And here we'll try to ease that process. It's also, for full disclosure, going to help us when it comes time for audit. If anyone here has been through an audit, you know that the external auditors do ask for a lot of information, and sometimes if you're very busy doing other things, it's very hard to get that information and to compile it. And so this timeline should help us go back in time and to help us get the documents that we might need. We are building an audit file as we go forward. But this is another reference. And then the last subpage, Tracking Porter County's ARPA Spending. To me, this is where there's going to be a lot of really exciting audit information. The very first, part 1, is the Auditor's Office Internal Controls. We are I think it's fair to say required, to have an internal control document outlining the policies and procedures that we are going to take to ensure compliance with this program. The U.S. Treasury's final rule talks about a robust monitoring program, and that's what we intend to have in the county auditor's office. And so our internal control document is going to outline our internal policies and procedures for tracking these expenditures. It will be posted as soon as it's finished. It's expected to be done very soon. Now, the next part is tracking the county government's ARPA expenditures, and we're building this as we speak. The first section is premium pay. We're going to list here, when did the council appropriate the monies, how much was appropriated, what has been expended to date. And then underneath each section, we're going to give a very brief discussion of why we think this program is in compliance with the final rule. Premium pay was pretty easy to address. It's right there. But there will be some of these projects that are going to lend themselves to additional audit analysis. And we will be preparing those documents as we go, and we'll be posting them online. I'll give you a heads up of what premium pay is going to say. We're going to explain to the public how we determined who in our county government, we're not going to name names, but we're going to say the process for our office to determine who was eligible for premium pay in compliance with what the county council decided. And we're also going to address how we analyze the wage threshold that the final rule required for premium pay. And yes, there were some employees who did not meet that wage threshold, and so they were not allowed premium pay. And so we're going to document all this. Why? Because sometime next year, the external auditors are going to come and they're going to ask us, well, how did you come up with this? And it's all going to be written there. And we will, to the extent that we feel that we can and should post it online, we will. So that concludes our tour of the auditor's website. It's in conjunction with the county's main page, but it does take on a different flavor. We maintain that page ourselves in the auditor's office, whereas the commissioners maintain the overall county government page. So there's lots of references for you to look at, whether you're looking at the county or more specifically the auditors. And that concludes the presentation that I plan to give today, but I am more than open to talking with any of you on any other topic or answering any questions that anyone may have. Yes, yes.
Is there another way you can submit your application other than just going online? My application's going to probably be 15 pages, and I just don't feel comfortable just going to the website and submitting it to the committees.
Well, we did have to have a process in place, a structure in place, and so that is the way to submit the proposal. And so you're saying that you would prefer to submit it a different way?
Yeah, how do you know they even saw it? How do you know it's even?
Oh, we will make sure that we see everything that's submitted. There will be nothing that won't be shared with the steering committee and or the subcommittees.
And then I was at your last presentation, and I thought you said something along the lines that tourism was exempt from certain restrictions.
That was probably with respect to proving if they were negatively impacted. The final rule presumes that certain populations were already negatively impacted or even disproportionately impacted. And if the population or the entity meets that classification, then the final rule says that you're presumed to be impacted. And so Treasury is saying that if you are a tourism or a hospitality venue, you are presumed to have been negatively impacted by COVID-19. Now, that doesn't mean that you automatically qualify for any of the funding. It means that you are a potentially eligible beneficiary. So remember that analysis that I talked about, where we have to identify a harm or an impact that was caused with respect to tourism. We don't have to. Treasury says you're already presumed impacted.
Does that include restaurants?
That's a good question. Restaurants would definitely be included if they fall under the small business section. But that's a very good question. Would restaurants be considered hospitality? I'm going to have to look that up. I am tempted to say not precisely, unless we come up with that other framework, if we follow the remaining framework that Treasury gives us. I'll see if I could look it up. Anyone else? Well, I'm trying to look this up. Yes.
You want me to come up there or ask from here?
It's up to you. I can repeat, but there is also a microphone if,
This is a
You-
very specific
okay.
question, and I'm just a resident. I'm thinking specifically about under the public health, preventing and responding to violence.
Yes.
And I'm thinking specifically about a terrorist attack that took place in Texas recently in a Jewish temple. I don't know if you remember that. But,
Yes.
uh,
I think it's the same one. Yeah.
Okay. Would something like this provide funding for, let's say, a church or a parochial school or a daycare center where there might be able to be put an alarm system that somebody could summon quietly police intervention if somebody had broken into a church service, for instance? Is something like that in line with what we're talking here?
My gut is that yes. Of course, it would depend on exactly what the proposal is, but I would say
Not out of line.
that it's not out of line. No, no. And you mentioned daycare centers. There's a focus on child care services because of the impact on not just child care facilities, but also working families not being able to afford child care during the pandemic. And that is one of the problems that we're experiencing, not to kind of get off on a well, it is definitely related, but the child care crisis right now is a very serious concern. Many families can't afford child care, and child care industry has been very much impacted by the pandemic. But I would think that without going into all of the final details, that would be one of the potential eligible uses. And then I am looking up, trying to define right now, I am just looking at the aid to impacted industries, including tourism, and I'm seeing travel, tourism, or hospitality sectors. So I would have to go into this a little bit further.
Yeah, I know, they didn't say, they just kept saying hospitality, and that's all they said. So what's hospitality? You need to find that out.
Right, exactly. I will look that up.
Like Sail Island, you know, that's just one example. Bowling alley, that's another example. You know, that's the business I'm in, so.
My gut is Zao Island is like a tourism attraction.
Right.
It feels like it. It looks like it. A bowling alley, is that more of a recreational? You're raising very good points.
Yeah.
And this might be one of those areas that falls under the maybe category, and so we would have to look at the final rule, we would have to look at the framework to see if we would have that justification. I am hesitant to say any final determination on any proposal, because it may sound good, but once you see what's actually being proposed, it might not fit, or it may not sound good at all, but it actually does fit. I don't know if that. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. Please stay in contact with us via the webpage, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.